Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana in the 26th week of 2014. I'm Carl Estabrook. Aware, a local peace group, was formed after the attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who saw that the U.S. government would use those crimes as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Middle East. The Mideast has the world's greatest concentration of oil and natural gas, and U.S. control over those energy resources gives it control over the economies of rival countries in Europe and Asia, notably the European Union and China. American control of the Mideast is part of the control of the worldwide economy that the U.S. has demanded since World War II. That control benefits the American economic elite, but not Americans in general. For 40 years, inequality in America has grown at an accelerating rate, while incomes for most Americans have been flat or have declined. But the wealth of the 1% has grown enormously. Almost all the income gains since the 2007-8 financial crisis have gone to the wealthiest 1% of Americans, as even President Obama, who works for them, acknowledges. President Obama is not unusual in that regard, by the way, in spite of his promises of hope and change. Over the last 50 years, U.S. presidents and executive branch leaders have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million of human beings, mostly civilians. In a worldwide survey of which nation threatens peace today, an overwhelming number named the U.S. and Israel at the top of the list. Obama, like Bush and their predecessors, says that he is fighting terrorism. But we call terrorists those who are fighting back against the invasion, occupation, and intimidation of their countries by the U.S. governments and its subordinates, notably Britain, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. Of course, those terrorists are capable of crimes in return, but even 9/11, a great crime, was a counterattack. Today, the Obama administration is conducting a worldwide imperial war. American death squads, we call them special forces, are active in more than 130 countries around the world. Although Americans don't know it, Obama has killed thousands of people with drone strikes alone, including hundreds of children. No other country, not China, not Russia, has foreign bases or conducts similar killings. No wonder the U.S. is hated around the world. But Obama's main task is to convince Americans that the war is winding down when it clearly isn't. 3/4 of Americans disapprove of the wars of the Bush-Obama years and the billions of dollars spent on them that could have been used here at home. Obama was elected to end the wars and provide jobs. He hasn't done either one, and American anger is growing. His job is to turn aside that anger. One way that's done is to use a compliant media to misrepresent the Obama administration's military and economic policy. Our task here at Aware of the Air, like similar independent programs around the country, is to combat that overwhelming propaganda. We'll try to do that tonight with reports and comments from Ron Zoke, A Bouquet of Bunkum, Deb Johnson on ISIS, not the goddess, David Green on the university and the irony chancellor, Stuart Levy on China and the U.S. with a report from United for Peace and Justice. And we'll begin with Ron Zoke, A Bouquet of Bunkum. I don't think that describes what he's offering, but rather what he's describing.
Well, who knows? Anyway,
That's not
I want
avant-garde.
to just bring up a few points quickly and move on. I'll make this as short as I can. There's some interesting notes in this week's Harper's Weekly Review of things that we may go on to talk about. Sunni militants affiliated with the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, also known as the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, I think Deb will say something about that, captured Iraqi border crossings with Jordan and Syria and at least 4 towns in Anbar province, laid siege to the government oil refinery outside the city of Baji, and went door to door in Baji to find wives. Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki announced a crackdown on officials he considers traitors. Tens of thousands of Shia men and women showed up at volunteer centers in response to a June 13th call by cleric al-Sistani to defend the country, and thousands of Shia militiamen affiliated with cleric Muqtada al-Sadr marched through Iraqi cities. Quoting, ISIL is not as strong as a finger against us, said a militant in Baghdad, where Shia paraded with dynamite taped to their torsos. Analysts monitoring jihadist internet forums suggested that ISIL leader al-Baghdadi had surpassed al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri as head of the global jihad in the minds of many fighters. Al-Qaeda was formed as a base for the Islamic State, said an ISI militant, and now we have it. It was reported that the Central Intelligence Agency had commissioned prototypes in 2006 of Osama bin Laden action figures intended for Pakistani children, whose faces would dissolve in heat to reveal bin Laden as a demon. And that U.S. Special Forces had entered Libya on June 15th and captured Ahmed Abba Katale, a suspected leader in the 2012 attacks on the American embassy in Benghazi. We should have some quality time with this guy, said Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina. I'd bring him to Guantanamo, said Senator John McCain. Oh, for God's sake, said Senator Leahy, Democrat of Vermont. So quality time, you can guess what that means.
Yeah.
Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, right? The United Nations representative said that the number of refugees from violence worldwide has reached more than 51 million, the highest point since World War II, and that nearly half of Syria's 22 million people were in urgent need of aid. At the White House, the spokesman for the administration, the press secretary, replacing Jay Carney is Josh Earnest, a oxymoronic name apparently that will lend itself to a lot of jokes and
some wild jokes. Yes.
yeah, right. Going on to Bibi Netanyahu is in the news again, warning the U.S. not to work with Iran on the Iraq crisis.
That's important.
He warned the close ally of the United States working with arch foe Iran in the effort to pull Iran back from the brink. Israel has consistently voiced fears that a swift jihadist offensive led by the Islamic State in Iraq and Levant, ISIL, that has swept up swaths of Iraq may prompt concessions to Iran from Washington, and of course we can't have that. Israeli leader criticizes Presbyterians. Israel's prime minister on Sunday criticized the Presbyterian Church USA to divest from U.S. companies and its vote to divest from U.S. companies that operate in in Israel. He called it misguided and unfair. In an address to an international gathering of Jewish journalists, he described Israel as a rare bright spot in a turbulent region, while he wondered why Israel had been singled out in all of this talk. When the Middle East is fragmented in this horrible war, the savage war between militant Shiites and militant Sunnis, the only places where you can have freedom, tolerance, protection of minorities, protection of gays, protection of Christians, and all other faiths is Israel, said Netanyahu. Trying to avoid guffawing, but anyway, the Presbyterian Church USA on Friday voted to sell church stock in Caterpillar, Hewlett-Packard, and Motorola Solutions, 3 companies whose products Israel uses in the occupied West Bank.
Bravo, bravo.
Human Rights Watch reports that a Palestinian whose camera captured the killing of two teenagers in Israel, has had his footage confiscated and the camera broken, reminiscent of the recent film, Five Broken Cameras, about what happened to those who tried to film what the IDF is doing in Israel. So, so much for that. And the Russian television RT office in Ramallah, which is apparently the de facto capital of the West Bank, was raided by the IDF, the Israel Defense Force. And a lot of equipment was broken. The place was vandalized. And the IDF had a story about that, saying that it was really the whole place used as a television location for a number of stations that they were raiding because they were concocting propaganda. 9 Syrian military targets have been hit by Israeli jets and guided missiles, the IDF says, claiming it was a decisive response to a series of cross-border shootings to protect the citizens of Israel. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights monitoring group, at least 10 members of the Syrian army were killed. So the strikes on targets in Golan Heights were carried out shortly after midnight. Another report, Israel launches airstrikes in Syria. Israel launched multiple airstrikes across Syria on Sunday in response to an attack on an Israeli defense contractor's vehicle in the Israel-occupied Golan Heights on the Syrian border. In a statement released Monday, the Israeli military stated IDF targeted 9 Syrian military positions, confirming direct hits. So that is one of the biggest hits since the Syrian conflict began over 9 years ago, and so on. In the local paper, there have been longish pieces appearing concerning the crisis in Syria by the commentator Trudy Rubin. Inattention, this says, has produced a growing disaster in Iraq. Indirect criticism of Barack Obama for not more war fighting, putting in more troops, and making a greater effort to hold Iraq. And another one by Andrew Basovich, who has something a little more sensible to say. But I will refer you to those in the local paper in the News Gazette on June 18th and 23rd. And with that, I will drop this comedy turn, I guess.
Thank you, Ron. Appreciate hearing about the importance of being earnest, at least.
Right.
Comedy is all to the good. We might say that the point that you raise about the government of Israel warning the U.S. Against working with Iran, I think is quite remarkable. If we had predicted 6 months ago that the president of Israel would be warning the U.S. against working with Iran, I think people would think that we were nuts. Yet that's precisely what he did this week. Now, I mention this or underline this only because it seems to me it suggests what a bad picture we usually get of what the U.S. is doing in the Middle East and what the various alignment of forces are. And that our task here, in some sense, is to try to straighten out some of that misinformation. It's the misinformation that's the problem. Other questions or comments about Ron's presentation?
Well, incidental note, is anyone else impressed by how moderate and conciliatory Vladimir Putin appears to be in the past few days? It's amazing.
It's quite amazing because he was last week's villain du jour, right?
Yeah.
And,
well,
you know,
they're
he's
using
been
the
displaced.
strongman line on him, but they haven't quite got to the madman line yet.
Well, and also he's confused the matter by saying, well, of course we've got to defend Maliki's government in Iraq. So, other comments on from?
I would just, in case anybody is too young to recall, Israel has occupied not only the West Bank and Gaza, or certainly controlled Gaza since 1967. It's also occupied the Golan Heights in Syria, and it's just taken for granted that this has been sort of informally annexed to Israel, when in fact there is no international status other than the fact that the Golan Heights is still occupied, and that, how dare Syria attack its own country, the part of its own country that's been occupied by Israel for 47 years. I don't know what the truth of any of these attacks is in terms of what aspect of whether it was the Syrian rebels or the Syrian government or made up or anything. I haven't done the research or looked at what the reports might be. I'm not sure if anybody really knows, but again, this is occupied territory, which has been illegally settled, every bit as illegally as the West Bank.
And it's in play, so to speak, again now with the U.S. Suggesting that well, like Lord Palmerston said in the 19th century, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And as the Obama administration tries to figure out what its permanent interests mean in this particular case, as far as tactics are concerned, people who thought they were permanent friends and permanent enemies turn out to be surprised. So we'll hear an example, or one of the reasons for this, from Deb Johnson, who wants to talk about Isis, not the goddess.
Right, and Isis was an Egyptian goddess who taught women how to grind corn and make bread, and how to tame men enough to live with them. So we really don't want to mix the two, I don't think. I just want to start off by a quote by Calvin Coolidge that says, "Perhaps one of the most important accomplishments of my administration has been minding my own business."
Good old silent Cal.
Yeah. And
When-
before I get into the ISIS unveil, the identity of the insurgency in Syria and Iraq, I found this wonderful little ditty here with John McCain, who actually met some of the ISIS warriors. And he says, it was a very moving experience to meet these fighters, and who have been struggling now for over 2 years, McCain said on CNN's Anderson Cooper 360. And they're very aware of the battlefield situation, and they're very disturbed about the dramatic influx of Hezbollah fighters, more Iranians, and of course stepped up activities of Bashar Assad. So I just thought that was just perfect. Okay, so I'm going to get into this, the origin of ISIS and ISIL as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, weaving the veil of ISIS. ISIS is a successor organization of the former Al-Qaeda in Iraq, allegedly established by Abdullah al-Rashid al-Baghdadi. Al-Baghdadi, however, was a creation of Al-Qaeda, a publicity figure with the function to endow the Saudi U.S. creation, quote, Al-Qaeda, unquote, with an Iraqi face, whom radicalized Iraqi Sunni Muslims could identify with. A briefing slide released by the multinational force Iraq on July 18, 2007, the organizational chart included a white box representing the position of Abu Omar Baghdadi, leader of the self-styled Islamic State of Iraq, which was purportedly set up last year. Dean Yates reports in a Reuters article dated July 18, 2007, a senior operative for Al-Qaeda in Iraq who was caught this month has told U.S. military interrogators a prominent Al-Qaeda-led group is just a front and its leader fictitious, a military spokesman said on Wednesday. Brigadier General Kevin Bergner told a news conference that Abu Ammar al-Baghdadi, leader of the self-styled Islamic State of Iraq, which was purportedly set up last year, did not exist. The Islamic State of Iraq was established to try to put an Iraqi face on what is a foreign-driven network, Bergner said. The name Baghdadi means the person hails from the Iraqi capital. One of the persons behind the al-Baghdadi brand was the Egyptian Abu Ayyub al-Masri, a close aide to and successor of al-Qaeda's Abu Musab al-Zakari, who was killed in a U.S. airstrike in June 2006. Al-Masri was politically active in Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, where he joined Ayman al-Zawahiri's Egyptian Islamic Jihad in 1982. He went on to the Osama bin Laden-run Fayoum training camp in Afghanistan in 1999. He came to Iraq via the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia in 2002. ISIS has been relatively dormant in Iraq, while some of its brigades became involved in the admittedly Saudi Arabia, U.S., Qatar, and Turkey-sponsored war on Syria. Weapons, other logistic supplies, and mercenaries for ISIS were predominantly transported from Saudi Arabia via smuggling routes in the Al-Anbar province. The Iran-friendly Iraqi government of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was left relatively unchallenged by ISIS, that is, Saudi Arabia and the U.S., until the al-Maliki administration in the autumn of 2012 decided to increase its military presence in Al-Anbar. The objective was to stop the flow of arms and fighters from Saudi Arabia to Syria. Although there is no detailed documentation for it available, it is likely that both Damascus and Tehran lobbied Baghdad to secure the smuggling routes. The closing of the smuggling routes led to increased tensions between Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. Shipments of weapons and fighters, which previously were routed via Iraq to Syria, had to be rerouted from Saudi Arabia via the Jordanian border town of Al-Mafraq. And forgive me for these pronunciations. U.S. troops and foreign fighters arrived in Al-Mafraq in late 2011. When traffic via Al-Mafraq increased in late 2012 and early 2013, the situation in Jordan turned critical. Jordanian members of parliament began to complain about the increased presence of U.S. troops, the flow of weapons via Jordan to Syria, and the increased presence of foreign fighters. In July 2013, the Deputy Speaker of the Jordanian Parliament, Khalid Atiyah, expressed his concerns about the increased presence of U.S. troops in Jordan, saying, quote, "As deputies representing the Jordanian people, we do not accept the United States or any other country's troops in Jordan. Jordanians do not think that Syria could pose a threat." The head of the Al-Quds Center of Political Studies, Arab Rentavi, stated in an interview with AFP, quote, "The Jordanians do not feel comfortable with the presence of U.S. troops and their weapons in the country. For the common people of Jordan, the U.S. military presence is associated with a conspiracy against Jordan's neighbors. Society does not welcome Americans here if they say they want to protect, even if they say they want to protect our country." The al-Maliki administration dilemma, the decision that prompted the rebirth of ISIS. As one can see, the administration of Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was confronted with a dilemma. One option was to let Saudi Arabia use the smuggling routes via the Al-Anbar province to appease Saudi Arabia, the U.S., and Jordan while falling out with Iraqi Shia lobbies, Tehran, and Damascus. The option would have brought an al-Maliki at least until the eventual fall of Damascus. The other option was to appease Damascus and Tehran by confronting the ISIS militants in Al-Anbar, Saudi Arabia, the U.S., and Western anti-Syrian alliance. Two factors may have contributed to the al-Maliki administration's decision for the second option. One of the primary reasons for core GCC members, core NATO members, and Israel's decision to launch the war on Syria was their determination to prevent the completion of the Iran-Iraq-Syria gas pipeline from the Iranian Pars gas fields in the Persian Gulf to the eastern Mediterranean coast of Syria. Al-Maliki must have known that Iraq would be next once Damascus would have fallen. The second is that al-Maliki administration is closely aligned with Tehran and pro-Iranian Shia lobbies in Iraq. Falling out with Tehran would have been equivalent to cutting ties with the only regional support al-Maliki administration could count on. The decision came in the autumn of 2012, when the Iraqi military was ordered to secure the smuggling routes in Al Anbar and confront the Saudi U.S. mercenaries, ISIS. In December, a senior Iraqi legislator issued a warning to media stressing the plots were being hatched by Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia against Iraq, calling on all citizens to be vigilant. A month earlier, PM al-Maliki warned that Saudi Arabia and Qatar are attempting to carry out, quote, an Iraq-style plot against Syria in an attempt to topple the government by deploying terrorists. In an interview with Lebanese Al Madin satellite network, al-Maliki spelled it out that a coup was planned against Iraq, saying, quote, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which are meddling to top the Syrian government, are now doing the same meddling to topple the Iraqi regime. Their goal is overthrowing the Iraqi government. Their goal is overthrowing the Iraqi ruling system and not overthrowing me. It's noteworthy that the U.S. think tank Stratfor in 2002 suggested to divide Iraq into 3 states. Nouri al-Maliki and members of his administration must have been aware of the fact the U.S. Vice President Joe Biden has endorsed this plan since 2002, when he was still a U.S. Senator. ISIS and the royal family of Saudi Arabia. Lawal al-Islam commander and chemical weapon expert Zaran Aloush has been working for Saudi intelligence since the 1980s. The direct involvement of Saudi Arabia's Interior Ministry and Intelligence Service in running al-Qaeda brigades in Syria, Iraq, and beyond is well documented. To mention one example, the founder and supreme commander of Lawal al-Islam, which was directly involved in the chemical weapons attack on the Damascus suburb East Ghouta on August 21, 2003, Zaran Aloush had been working for Saudi intelligence since the 1980s. ISIS is under the direct command of members of Saudi Arabia's royal family. January 2014, Al-Arabi published an article and video featuring the interrogation of an ISIS fighter who had been captured in Syria. The article and the full video has since been removed, but the Saudi Arabia-funded Institute for Gulf Affairs still has an excerpt of the video on its YouTube channel, which was uploaded on January 22, 2014. Briefly about the background, Saudi Arabian and Qatari proxy brigades have been involved in heavy fighting in Syria since 2012, leading ultimately to the near elimination of Qatari proxy brigades, while Saudi brigades have gained the upper hand through Syria. Details about this infighting are explained in the article, Top U.S. and Saudi Officials Responsible for Chemical Weapons in Syria. When questioned why ISIS is shadowing the move of the Free Syrian Army and who has given the orders, the captured ISIS fighter states that he didn't know why, but that the orders were given by Abu Faisal, also known as Prince Abdul Rahman al-Faisal, the brother of Prince Saud al-Faisal and Prince Turki al-Faisal. Interrogator, question, why do you ISIS monitor the movement of the Free Syrian Army? Detainee, I don't know exactly, but we receive our orders from ISIS command. Who among ISIS gave the orders? Prince Abdul Rahman al-Faisal, who is now also known as Abu Faisal. The supreme commander of ISIS is Prince Abdul Rahman al-Faisal, the royal Saudi family member, Saudi Arabia's Interior Ministry and its intelligence service. ISIS unveiled to close a standard Saudi, U.S., NATO-run intelligence operation and mercenary army. There's nothing mysterious about ISIS. It's not even mysterious that Western mainstream media fail to report the facts. Preemptive disclosure. Saudi and U.S. governments have standard response to embarrassing public disclosures about prominent Saudis' involvement in running mercenary terrorism operations. The example of Osama bin Laden is the prototype from which the standard model for disinformation campaigns was developed. Osama, the world is told, was, quote, the black sheep of the bin Laden family. The veil of misinformation is held up by complicit mainstream media, including those who do most to convince their readers that they are no intelligence fronts like, quote, The Guardian. After the incidents of September 11, 2001, which became the justification for the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq under false claims, quote, The Guardian, unquote, did what was expected of an MI5 infiltrated newspaper. October 12, 2001, The Guardian published an interview with Osama bin Laden, brother Abdullah, titled, quote, No Brother of Mine. The Guardian is letting Abdullah tell, quote, The Guardian's readers, quote, It is my understanding that in the early 90s, the family repeatedly reached out and made attempts to plead with Osama to moderate his views. Abdullah says, after these attempts failed, there was a reluctant but unanimous consensus that Osama should be disowned. The man who is commanding the 2014 Saudi-U.S. war on Iraq has been Saudi Arabia's Deputy Minister of Defense from 1978 to 2011. He is also the brother of Prince Saud al-Fazl and Prince Turk al-Fazl. Prince Saud al-Fazl has been the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia since October 13, 1975. He is also the second son of King Faisal. Turki al-Faisal has served as Saudi Arabia's Director of Intelligence from 1979 to 2001. He has been Saudi Arabia's ambassador to both the United States and the United Kingdom. And he resigned from his post as Director of Intelligence only days before the, quote, terrorist attacks in the U.S. on September 11, 2001. Turki al-Fazl publicly blamed Iraqi Prime Minister al-Maliki for the loss of large parts of northern Iraq to terrorists. ISIS unveiled the two-headed monster. We have unveiled ISIS, and ISIS unveiled turned out to be a two-headed monster. The body consists of volunteers, mercenaries, and Saudi, Turkish, and U.S. intelligence operatives, special forces. Its two heads are the royal family of Saudi Arabia and CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, USA. Any appraisal of any foreign political or military intervention in Iraq without considering these facts would lead to the wrong conclusion. It's precisely, therefore, that one will not find any of this information in other than fragmented form in any of the Western or Gulf Arab media. And this article was written by Christoph Lehmann, founder and editor of NSNBC.
Thank you, Deb. This is the problem, certainly. It's a problem not just for the media accounts of what's going on in Iraq, but it's a problem for the United States government, which has some difficulties in making it run in the Middle East. And I'm not entirely convinced of the account that we've just heard from Deb, but it's far better than what we're hearing from the American media. You're listening to Aware on the Air, watching Aware on the Air, and we'll go now to some local concerns. Aware member David Green will talk about the university and the irony chancellor. I must admit I like the title.
Well, thanks for making that title up, Carl. I used the word irony in a letter I wrote to the News Gazette in response to an article by Chancellor Phyllis Wise in last Sunday's Sunday commentary section. You know, everybody in Champaign-Urbana, who's anybody, gets up on Sunday morning and anxiously looks at the Sunday commentary section to find out what to think about all the important issues in the world. This past Sunday, they were greeted with a couple of articles about Little League, and so we know now what to think about Little League. We also were met with an article by one of the trustees or by the chair of the board decrying liberal students for not letting Condi Rice and people like that speak at graduation ceremonies, and how terrible that was for academic freedom and so forth. And finally, in this rather non-spectacular issue of the News Gazette, maybe next Sunday will be more spectacular, especially if they publish an article that I've submitted to them, which I think they probably will. There was an article by Phyllis Wise, chancellor of our establishment, local establishment, commemorating the 70th anniversary of D-Day and of the advent of the GI Bill of Rights and of the GI Bill, which allowed so many returning servicemen and I assume some women to go to college free after World War II. She wrote, in conclusion to this article, she wrote that it seems every generation must learn that the costs of war aren't measured in dollars, but in lost human potential. Whether in the world wars, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, or Iraq, shattered bodies, battered spirits, and families torn asunder remain a stark, unvarying reality of conflict in any era. But and then she continues, as we saw in 1944, it is in these darkest moments when we come to understand defining truths and we act with the clarity and determination to ensure that we aren't lost in those shadows, but that we learn from them. Today, 70 years later, the GI Bill stands as the singular and enduring American declaration that the most powerful transformative force on earth isn't a gun, a tank, or a bomb. And Phyllis Wise concludes, no, it is an education. I guess I had a couple of comments of general reactions to this article. One was what happened to the GI Bill. It was not only the GI Bill, it was succeeded by a decade or two, or 2.5 at least, or maybe 3, in which colleges were essentially free, not just for returning servicemen, but for most students who qualified for them in the major public universities of most states in this country. It seems like there was a lesson to be learned from both World War II and the manner in which that was funded, as well as in which the infrastructure, education, and so forth was funded in the 1950s. There's a lot to learn from that. I mean, we shouldn't go back to the military Keynesianism, but we can certainly understand that when the government wants to employ people, it can. When it wants to use its resources and bring labor to bear on those resources in order to either fight a war or provide for basic needs or even a growing middle class, it can certainly do that. So it seems like the question Phyllis Wise should be asking is, why do we no longer do that? She's talking about the GI Bill while students at this university and most others are going into debt that really distorts their finances and their lives as they move on from college. But more important, and let me just read you an excerpt of the letter that I penned to the paper. Even more troubling is Wise's assertion about the costs of war. Wars are not tornadoes. She treats these wars from World War II to the present as if they're an act of nature, not bothering to comment on the choices involved. I continue in my letter, they are political choices, and for all American wars since 1945, immoral and pernicious choices. Wise sees education as transformative, and here's where the irony comes in, but won't question that the U.S. has the right to rule the world by force. Her argument is ironically a triumph of conventional wisdom over the critical thinking required to end the costs of wars that she refers to and implicitly justifies. So I understand that some people might be, probably not people watching this show, but people who will read my letter will say, well, you know, can't Chancellor Wise just write a silly column about the GI Bill and how wonderful it was, commemorating D-Day and all the heroism that was involved in that, and can't you just not take this so seriously? But Chancellor Wise presides over this university funded by the defense industry. She invites speakers like Donald Augustine, former CEO of Lockheed Martin, to come and advise our university on our vision of the future and talk about excellence and all this stuff. So it seems to be that Phyllis Wise should set an example of somebody who does critical thinking, who questions the conventional wisdom and the assumptions that don't question the idea of why it is that there's so much labor in this country going to waste, or so many skills going to waste, and B, why, when those skills are utilized, they're so often employed in defense industries and in fighting wars, and that the university is very complicit in these, and why it is that the university has to submit to this austerity regime that's so much a part of this neoliberal era in government and global finance and so forth. So these are all the questions that I'd like to raise with Phyllis Wise and with those people that are that dare to have a kind of a critical response to the kind of things that get said in the Sunday commentary section.
Thank you, David. It is, yes, a Sunday morning trial to read the commentary system in the section of the News Gazette, but you're absolutely right. It shows what the people who are controlling the limits of allowable debate are actually thinking. Comments and responses to David?
Well, I think it's an excellent point. I mean, you know, if you have Lockheed Martin coming, you should be able to have people who promote peace. So, you know, I hope it's balanced.
Unfortunately, it was not.
That's
Unfortunately, Donald Augustine was not balanced by anyone except the people who turned up at that event to protest.
Yeah,
So-
problems about financing higher education and the role of the GI Bill or its successor are becoming more and more prominent, I think, even in the mainstream press. There's a new movie out, apparently a documentary called Ivory Towers, about the growing questions about whether it's worthwhile in terms of expense and gain to attend an institution of higher education. And for a long time, we've been told that in order to get a good job, you need a good education. But you get a good education, supposedly, go $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 into debt and student loans, and still there's no job. So that's the situation that we're in.
Well, and it's clear that there's a sort of a two-step development in American higher education, certainly in the years that I've been associated with universities. The 1960s saw the universities as a source for politics outside the limits of allowable debate, for questioning of America's killing people abroad for the profits of the 1%, the anti-Vietnam War movement. The American ascendancy, the American elite is not stupid and they're not slow. They made sure that that didn't happen again. They had to make sure that the universities were brought into control, and they were. I saw what happened, as I say. That was what I laughingly call my career. The way in which the universities were subjected to control at every level, from the professoriate down to the lowliest freshman. Most recent method of doing this is to load tremendous debt on undergraduates so that they don't dare stick their head up or complain about what the university is doing or what the country is doing. First of all, they need that degree. The only way they can get that degree is by being quiet, and the only way they can pay for it is continuing to be quiet. So the debt trap is not an accident. It's a conscious policy of American higher education over the last 40 years. Believe me, I saw it happen.
Yeah, I wrote in a recent letter to the editor in response to all the furor over the hiring and perhaps firing of James Kilgore on our campus here about the vindictive emotional energy that seemed to go into this debate that obviously had so much to do with the politics of the 1960s and the fact that students rebelled against war in the 1960s. And so it's an interesting contrast to hear Phyllis Wise write this letter as if none of that ever happened, and if the reverberations of that still aren't going on this campus at this time, as people start talk about about terrorists, about domestic terrorists, and outside agitators, and all those code words that have been used or implied in the discussion as to why somebody can't be employed at our university who has a past of being involved in what in the larger scheme of things were relatively trivial, although immoral, acts of violence in the 1960s, meanwhile not talking about the millions of people killed by American foreign policies then and since.
I like the observation of the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the University of Illinois that anyone involved with terrorism shouldn't be employed by the university. Now, not only would that wipe out the entire political science department and a good bit of the history department and several of the others, it would also take all those veterans of the Afghanistan and Iraq campaigns and a good number of other veterans off the books. I mean, hey, if they're involved with terrorism, they
Well, I
shouldn't
think
be there.
Pepe Escobar, you know, named the U.S. the Empire of Chaos
Yes.
in his latest article, which is very true.
And a subject to discuss as our program continues. We want to make sure that Pepe's observations are revealed to a yet unknowing world.
Right, right.
You're watching Aware on the Air. We're going to turn now to a report from Stuart Levy on a discussion on China in the U.S. We move continually west, I guess, here today, from the United for Peace and Justice group.
So this is from a series of conference calls that United for Peace and Justice is organizing on different peace-related topics. And this latest one was from a longtime activist who is Chinese, Japanese American named Li Xiuhin. He's an interesting character, sort of straddling fences in many directions. He's lived in China and in the US and in Canada. He's been a reporter for Pacifica. He's written a good deal about the military-industrial complex. He's the national coordinator for the National Immigrant Solidarity Network. He's active in United for Peace and Justice. He's also an aerospace engineer. Anyway, so he now lives and works in between China and the US. And so he was the one talking about how sort of the political development in China and potentials for collaboration between activists between China and the U.S. So he explained he's worn a number of hats: social justice groups, peace groups, and government agency. He's worked with people carrying left and right-wing perspectives. He's seen China becoming more right-wing, and that what means left and right-wing in China is different, often wildly different from what it means in the U.S. And so he spends a fair amount of time talking about what it does mean. So he opened with a couple of caricatures. So the Chinese left, their issues are supporting the socialist economy, popular democracy, workers' rights. They're Maoist. They're friendly with Russia and North Korea. They support the Palestinians. They support Iran. The right, the caricature of the right is that they are upper middle class or wealthy. They may be intellectuals. They tend to be pro-US and anti-communist. They support a free market economy and the neoliberal ideology. They oppose Russia and North Korea. And the Chinese right is encouraged by the prospect of more US influence in the region. He talked about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that has come up a number of times on this program. This is a big so-called trade agreement, but it would actually be a corporate rights agreement involving a number of countries, including China and the US. So Li Xiuhin comments, most people in Asia, on the left or the right, believe that the TPP will benefit the US more than it will the Asian countries. Those on the right in China are more likely to support the TPP, as they see it as a way to smash the socialist economy and transition to a capitalist neoliberal one. He sees the US as using a TPP as a tool to drive military partnership, not just trade, but military partnerships with Asian countries, especially Japan and South Korea, and that it's supporting the TPP not just for economic control, but also to build more military bases, to sell more military hardware, to create ad hoc alliances against China, North Korea, and Russia. And that many in the Asian progressive community I assume that's the same thing that he talks about as the left, see the TPP as a new form of Cold War, forming alliances against China and Russia. Talked about U.S. military influence in Asia increasing since the end of the Cold War. It says, yes, the U.S. has been doing this over the last 30 or 40 years. And then an interesting comment that I hadn't heard made elsewhere. Remember that it was Asian countries, Korea and Vietnam, they were the only ones to actually defeat the U.S. military since World War II. If the U.S. wants to control Asia, this is not an easy task, and their only route to doing it, our only route to doing it, is to divide and conquer. So the U.S. has already military bases in Japan. It had them in Philippines too until the People's Revolution there. And now, you may have heard, I don't know if anybody here has been talking about this, but the current Philippine leader is talking about bringing a U.S. military base back to the Philippines, something that Washington has been dreaming about. Japan has been seeking to change its Pacific constitution. This is the aspect of the Japanese constitution that forbids it from having weapons of mass destruction or armies except to guard its own soil. So he says, did you say 2 minutes? Okay.
No,
All right.
go ahead.
Sorry. All right.
No, go ahead.
Great.
Sure.
Okay. So who within Japan supports giving that up? He says mainly the Japanese right wing, but also the Japanese middle class support giving up that Pacific institution. And he sees it as connected with the movement going from the government into parts of the Japanese community to deny, for example, that Japan has invaded other countries in the past, that they had sex slaves during the time of World War II, all of that, that that's of a piece. There was something I didn't understand about the kamikaze pilots at the end of World War II being seen by this aspect of Japanese society as part of world cultural heritage. So strange as that sounds. There's this dream within Japan of Japan becoming, again, a military superpower. Something many peace-loving Asian people, including especially the left, are against this, of course. Let's see. There's talk between China and Russia of closer cooperation, not just the recent gas deal, shipping Russian gas to China, which was signed, but also more military and economic pacts, and maybe especially relevant to us is a U.S. de-dollarization. So being able to do trade between Russia and China without involving dollars as the default currency. Many regional organizations have been created without U.S. inclusion, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the U.S. is not happy about that. He talked about solidarity on the level of activists. Li Xiuhin comments, there are many broad-based activist groups in China on the left and the right. Most people there don't understand about U.S. activists, what they're doing or who they are or what they care about, which seems only fair, and I'm sure that, it's a mutual statement. The Chinese right wing has its own magazine and newspaper to bring, aimed at bringing U.S. neoliberal policies to China. On the U.S. side, it's hard to convince U.S. activists to work with Chinese activists. There's a language barrier. Usually, if you do find someone, if you as a U.S. activist do find someone in China who will work with you, the people you'll find are mostly middle class and mostly pro-U.S. policies. I thought that was a very interesting comment. So, anyway, but regardless of that, he sees binational cooperation as being a very important thing to promote, and there were some questions about that later. So then there were some questions. Someone asked about something I'd never heard of, the RCEP, a Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Do people see this as an alternative to TPP? I looked up sort of the headline about it. It is indeed a regional partnership. It involves the ASEAN nations like Malaysia and so forth, the Philippines, Vietnam. as well as China and India and Australia and New Zealand. It doesn't involve the US or any European countries. Do people in China see this as a viable alternative to TPP? And he sort of broke it down. The left will consider it an evil agreement. The center left and center right would consider it reluctantly as a basis to work from, and the right would wholeheartedly endorse it. They would cheer it on. A comment about that there are people in China who are simply paid by the U.S. to promote U.S. policy. And I thought that was interesting, not maybe essentially surprising, but you wonder in what terms it gets promoted. You know, are these sort of PR agents working within the Chinese media? I'd sort of like to know more about that. And he made a similar comment about Japan. There's a question about China, Japan, U.S. dynamics. Japanese military will indeed be a threat to China's security over the coming century, as it was over the last century. Some Chinese and Korean opinions consider Japan as only a foot soldier to U.S., although Lee Siew-hin considered that harsh. Well, I'll stop with that bit. Let's see. There was a question about anti-China propaganda in the U.S. and the sentiment in the U.S. toward China. And the questioner in that case raised something that I hadn't heard before, but maybe some of you have, that the Free Tibet movement is something that was started and is being promoted by the CIA. So Lee Siew-hin didn't comment on that, but I thought that was an interesting bit. Let's see. Will a few simple color revolutions overthrow the Chinese government? No, they will not. Calls in the U.S. for military action against China has historical precedent, like with respect to Vietnam or Nicaragua. Right now, there are many terrorist attacks happening within China, especially in Western China and near the Afghan border, which he commented, the New York Times has carefully not labeled these as terrorist organizations. They are just angry people. But the headquarters of these organizations are in the U.S. Let's see. I know the time is short, right? So I'll try to pick up just another couple of things.
Well, Stuart, one thing I would mention from what you've presented, I think it's important that it's the longstanding peace group, United for Peace and Justice, that sponsored this conversation, because it's clear that American war policy is bound up with relationships to China. That's what Obama's pivot to China is all about. Economic rivalry with China is at the heart of this administration's policies, and it's obviously connected with the attempt by the U.S. to control world oil flows. In the Pentagon, they speak of offshore control. It's a Pentagon euphemism for denying China the ability to import by sea oil. And this has been a conscious policy of the American government, discussed openly in the Pentagon for some time. Now, what China has done just within the last month is sign a massive oil deal with Russia, which has oil, in order to defeat this American attempt to control the Chinese economy by offshore control, by the control of the import of oil into China. So the issue of the United States relations to China is directly bound up with the people that Obama is killing in the Middle East. These they couldn't be more intimately involved. And I think one of the reasons for that is that what's really happened over the last 40 years, I take issue with the notion that China is in any sense a socialist economy. President Xi is no more a socialist than President Obama is. And I would say that over the last 40 years, what's happened is that China and the United States have converged quite remarkably. They are both now neoliberal oligopolies. And they are in conflict, there's no question about that. The administration is perfectly aware of that, and it's the basis of a lot of their policies. Ron?
We're at the end, I think.
You have been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. This is Carl Estabrook for Stuart Levy, Deb Johnson, Ron Zook, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying good night and good luck.